Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm a big admirer of everything Korea. You guys are a leading force in the world of entertainment, which is a field I study in many, many ways. And what I'll be talking about today is the entertainment business as I've studied it. It mostly applies to the US, what I'm going to be talking about, but I think many of these principles are quite universal, and you may see one or two Korean names pop up along the way as well. But here we go. So the title is Soft Power, the Future of the Entertainment Business. I have about 20 minutes, so I'm going to go quite fast, but what I thought is I'd do is highlight what I see as the major trends in the world of entertainment. And I've divided it into four areas. I'll be talking about the role of blockbusters, or how companies, entertainment businesses, think about investing in products. I'll be talking about superstars, or how companies can think about investing in talent. I'll be talking about the role of digital technology, which of course is an undeniable force in today's entertainment business, and then I'll talk about a little bit more generally about whether some of these principles might apply to businesses that we don't necessarily always include when we think about the entertainment business or the creative industries, but I think definitely deserve a place among those industries. At Harvard, I'm used to walking around constantly, but now I'm stuck behind this platform, but please bear with me. The story starts with these two men. I don't know if you know who they are, but on your right, you see Jeff Zucker. He, for about a decade ago, was the head of entertainment at NBC in the United States, which is one of the major broadcast networks. He had a really interesting vision, which I think ties to the comments we've seen earlier this morning about the economy and how the economy isn't always in a great shape. He was looking around the landscape and he said, we should not be taking these big risks. We are spending a lot of money on television shows. NBC was the #1 at the time, but he said we are taking too much risk. And he implemented what he called a managing for margin strategy, meaning I'm going to focus on profits, or I'm going to focus on margins, and we're not necessarily going to focus on spending the most amount of money on expensive formats, A-list stars, and expensive pilots. And what's interesting, as he was implementing his strategy, there's another man to your left. This is actually a photo from him in the classroom, in my classroom. They both look pretty happy at the time. But this other man is Horne. He's currently the chairman of Disney Pictures in the United States. At the time that I studied him, he was the COO of Warner Brothers, where he decided which movies got made. He has the green light decision, as they call it. And he said the very opposite of what Jeff Zucker said. He said we should be taking more risk. We should not be afraid to embrace risk, and we should not be afraid to spend a lot of money on the projects that we believe in the most. We should, in a way, make blockbuster bets. And he implemented his strategy. It's called the event film strategy, or the tentpole strategy in Hollywood, where he said, I'm going to spend maybe upwards of $200 million on 3, 4, or 5 films every given year. Those are big risks, but we think they will have big returns. And if we fast forward about a decade later, I don't know how many of you know how their careers ended. Jeff Zucker took NBC down from the #1 position to the #4 position, lost tremendously in terms of ratings, but also lost in terms of the margins, right? So his strategy of cost saving was actually a big disaster. Whereas Horne, under his leadership at Warner Brothers, they saw arguably the best decade in filmmaking, with very high profits, over $1 billion in revenues at the domestic box office, 11 consecutive years, and much more success internationally. And I think that goes to the core of one of the big insights I've learned in the world of entertainment, which is that you shouldn't be afraid to embrace risk, right? You shouldn't be afraid to go all in if you're trying to have successes. What, in fact, the leading content producers do, this I think is really important to know for any entertainment business. whether it's a film studio or a television network or a book publisher or a video game publisher, or a record label or any of these other businesses, is that they are not afraid to bet heavily on what they see are the most likely winners. So if you think about this, this graph, say a film studio investing in 20 projects or so, they invest a disproportionate amount of their budget on what they see are the most likely winners, and they're expecting this in terms of their return, right? So they're expecting that those big gambles would yield the highest revenues. And that is typically, if you look close, that's typically what we see. Here's some data. I promise this is the only complicated graph I'm going to show you today. Here you see some data for the last 5 years under Alan Horne's tenure at Warner Brothers. These are all the films that were coming out of the studio, and you see a plot of the production budget and then the worldwide box office revenues. Here are some of the titles, in case you were wondering. So the Harry Potters are doing very well, big investments, also big returns. Inception, The Dark Knight, also big investments, but big returns. Some not so good, right? The Green Lantern, Speed Racer, and Terminator Salvation were big investments, but they didn't necessarily yield the return that they were going for. And on the other hand, you see some small investments. The Blind Side, I don't know if that was a movie that reached Korea. The Hangover, I'm certain that one reached Korea. And a few other ones that were small investments that actually did relatively well. It seems a messy picture. If you look at this more systematically, this is what you see. So if you look at the middle set of bars, you see that the top 10% of titles for Warner Brothers over those 5 years cost 34% of the budget, but yield 46% of the surplus that results when you take the revenues and deduct the cost, right? So the big investments account for a disproportionate amount of the income for the studio, and that we see if we look very closely at many of these businesses. The lowest investments, the cheapest titles, account for a small share of the budget. Look at the bottom 25%, for instance, and an even lower share of the actual profits. This is not unusual. Warner Brothers is not unusual. I find this everywhere that I've looked in my research. Here's another graph for a book publisher that I studied called Grand Central Publishing. This one's even more extreme. They invest 64% of all their money in the top 10% biggest titles, the top 10% most expensive titles, and those titles account for 126% of the profits. That means that they make a loss on the 90% least expensive titles, right? They make a loss. And they know that going in. This is how the entertainment business works. And the cheapest titles hardly account for any of the profits or the revenues. This is what we see across the entertainment landscape. And this, I think, is one of the biggest myths that anyone who wants to compete, and I think that would go for Korea as much as it goes for the US, anyone who wants to compete in this business needs to realize that the notion that you can escape risk by making smaller bets, that's a myth. In fact, the biggest bets, these big investments, big movies or big A-list music albums or otherwise based on strong brands, those are actually the safest investments that you could find. Which means, and this I think is really important, right? There might be a tendency if the economy is not going well or if you feel that you're under pressure to go and deviate from the plan to make these big bets. But if you want to find continued success, you have to embrace risk. There is no way, in other words, if you compete in the entertainment business, to play it safe. You can't play it safe by making smaller bets, and if you make big bets, by definition, those tend to be risky. So this, I think, is an important lesson that entertainment businesses have to learn over their existence. Now that's on the investing in products, and I'd be happy to talk more about that in the question part. I've also looked quite a bit at investments in stars, and I've looked at that quite a bit in the world of sports. Here you see some soccer teams that I've studied. Real Madrid, and I'm sure that you're more familiar with soccer teams than most of my American students. Real Madrid, a Spanish club, is known for investing heavily in the world's biggest stars, much like Hollywood studios do. Boca Juniors is a team in Argentina, is known for developing talent. And then I had the fortune to work quite a bit with Sir Alex Ferguson at Manchester United, which has a model both of developing talent, but then also of investing in A-list stars. And one of the things that emerges from, one of the lessons that emerges from my research in in the world of sports, but also entertainment more generally, is that just like betting on blockbusters gives you a big advantage, betting on superstars makes bets safer too, right? If you're looking for a way